Apologetics is hard work, and it'd be a lot easier if folks would just believe whatever it says in the Gospels just 'cause it says so. And maybe that's why Dr. Craig has 5 arguments for why believers ought to ignore whatever historians and critical scholars has to say. Hey there, folks. Bertram the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. We're in Chapter 8, and Dr. Craig has promised to share with us some recent New Testament scholarship that supposedly has overthrown modern skeptical scholarship and firmly established the conclusion that the New Testament is not just a reliable historical document, but is the only reliable account of the life, death, and alleged resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. Oddly enough, though, all he's done so far to back up that claim is to encourage believers not to look at the evidence. He wants them to assume that anybody who tries to show them the evidence is just trying to deceive them. I find that more than just a little sus. But fear not, it gets better. And by better, I mean, well, maybe I should just let you see for yourselves. Quote, "Here we confront the very crucial question of the burden of proof. Should we assume that the Gospels are reliable unless they are proven to be unreliable? Or should we assume that the Gospels are unreliable unless they are proven to be reliable?" End quote. Anytime apologist brings up the question of who has the burden of proof for Christian claims, you can pretty much count on it that it's because they desperately wants to get out of it. Whatever stories they tells us, they want us to just believe it because they says so without having to meet any kind of burden. They don't want to have to give us reasonable evidence for what they claim, even though that is literally their job description. They wants us to just assume that everything they tells us is true. And that's exactly what Dr. Craig is arguing here. The Gospels is a written record of some of the things that early Christians was claiming, and he wants us to decide up front whether or not we's going to assume that they's true before we even look at the evidence. I mean, he uses the word reliable to try and make it sound like he's applying some kind of rigorous historical methodology, but reliable just means we ought to take their word for it whenever they tells us stuff. Plus, of course, genuine historians never resorts to the false dichotomy of saying that either a document is entirely reliable or else entirely unreliable. That ain't how history works. But that's how Dr. Craig would like us to think that history works. And wait till you hear his justification for demanding an upfront assumption that the Gospels is all true. Quote, "Are they innocent until proven guilty, or guilty until proven innocent? Skeptical scholars almost always assume that the Gospels are guilty until proven innocent. I'm not exaggerating here. This really is the procedure of skeptical critics." End quote. And I got to tell you, I laughed out loud when I read this. This is such a clumsy attempt to defend the Gospels that it's almost a parody. He's taken the principle that says the government ain't supposed to punish folks without good reason, and he's applying it to how folks judges whether or not to believe what they's being told. And he's trying to make it sound like skeptics is violating the human rights of the Gospels by not just taking their word for everything, even though, the Gospels ain't humans. What he's doing here is advocating for us to make gullibility our primary tool for doing history, unless and until some skeptic can prove that a story can't possibly be true. We ought to believe everything that folks tells us just 'cause they says so. Bigfoot really does exist. UFOs actually does abduct folks and subject them to some unmentionable probing. Atlantis really did sink into the ocean in a single day. Joseph Smith really did receive a book of golden plates from an angel named Moroni. Muhammad really did split the moon, and Hercules really did become a demigod after doing all them labors. And I tell you, we could use Hercules' help here because this is an Augean stable's worth of BS. Historians don't assume that the Gospels is either true or false. What historians does is say, let's look and see. They don't condemn the document sight unseen, they simply ask the questions, what reasons do we have to conclude that this claim is or is not true? Unfortunately for Dr. Craig, the answers to them questions ain't what he would consider helpful for evangelistic purposes. The reasons for why we should believe the Gospels pretty much boils down to because they said so, and hence his emphasis on believing whatever they tells us by default. But, of course, there's all kinds of reasons why we ought not to just take their word for everything, such as the fact that we just plain don't never see any God in the real world behaving the way as the Gospels describes him as behaving. But to be fair to Dr. Craig, he don't always recommend gullibility as his go-to method for determining what's true. He only applies it to the Gospels. And, of course, he takes the exact opposite approach when it comes to research being done by historians and critical scholars. We're supposed to presume that they is guilty until proven innocent. Or, in other words, that nothing they says is true. And he's got 5 reasons why we ought to assume that. Quote, number 1, there was insufficient time for legendary influences to erase the core historical facts. End quote. Meanwhile, in the real world, Donald Trump started spreading stories about the 2020 elections being stolen a few months before they even happened. There ain't no minimum required waiting time before folks can start telling whatever story suits them. You ain't got to erase the facts, all you got to do is ignore them in favor of a narrative that some folks is going to like better. And that don't take no time at all. Renee Good was murdered by an ICE agent on video from multiple different angles as she was steering away from him. And yet, almost immediately, right-wing news media was reporting that she was a violent terrorist who tried to run over him and that he was shooting in self-defense from off to one side of the car. That ain't even a self-consistent story, but that's the version you'll hear consistently repeated by right-wing media. Whether or not they spend time to erase any core historical facts, biased reporters can give biased reports starting from the very first moment. So no, this ain't a valid reason to refuse to fact-check the claims made in the Gospels, because we do still have facts to check, which is why Dr. Craig don't want believers listening to historians and critical scholars. So let's see what his next excuse is going to be. Quote, number 2, the Gospels are not analogous to folk tales or contemporary urban legends. Tales like those of Paul Bunyan and Pecos Bill, or contemporary urban legends like the Vanishing Hitchhiker, rarely concern actual historical individuals, and thus are not like the Gospel narratives, which are about real people who actually lived, real events that actually occurred, and real places that actually existed. End quote. Unfortunately, his own argument defeats itself here. He says that folktales and urban legends rarely concern real persons. He can't say that they's never about real folks, because sometimes they is, which means that sometimes folktales and urban legends is analogous to the Gospels, or at least they could be, which means that it's legitimate for historians to check and see if they is. And thing is, there's a whole lot more than just folk tales and urban legends to consider here. As the internet and social media has shown us, there's a whole broad category of viral stories that spreads rapidly and attracts their own audiences of enthusiastic supporters. Nowadays we got memes and conspiracy theories and talking points and on and on. But what they all has in common is that they strikes a chord with certain folks, such that some folks is likely to embrace them as true with no concern for fact-checking. Maybe the story itself is sensational or shocking. Maybe it validates some deeply held belief that's otherwise hard to find validation for. Maybe it reinforces social constructs that privileges some folks at the expense of others. Or maybe it's something else. But the point is, a story don't have to be true to be immediately popular. And the Gospels very definitely fit within this category on multiple counts. So Dr. Craig's second excuse for ignoring modern scholarship ain't gonna fly neither. Let's see if he can do any better on the next one. Quote, number 3, the Jewish transmission of sacred traditions was highly developed and reliable. In an oral culture like that of first century Israel, the ability to memorize and retain large tracts of oral tradition was a highly prized and highly developed skill. The disciples would have exercised similar care with the teachings of Jesus. End quote. Now, earlier I mentioned that oral tradition was something that still exists even among Protestant Christians today. And this right here is a good example. It's a story that's widely circulated and accepted among believers because it validates their belief that first century oral tradition was just as reliable as written records. But historically speaking, it's just a popular myth. First of all, by the first century, Judaism already had written scriptures as well as written commentaries, so there wasn't no need for anybody to memorize huge chunks of it verbatim. Which ain't to say that they didn't have kids memorizing bits of it in Sabbath school, but, well, did you ever have to memorize anything as a kid? How much of it do you still remember verbatim? Plus, Dr. Craig refers to oral tradition in the singular as if they was one single monolithic tradition that all Jews held in common. If you know anything at all about historical Jewish culture, you'll know that one is definitely a myth. There was all kinds of conflicting Jewish traditions back then, of which the most famous is the Pharisees versus the Sadducees, not to mention all the other groups that disagreed with both. As for the early Christian disciples, we know that they also had various conflicting traditions, which is why Paul and other New Testament writers so frequently warned against listening to Christians who they branded as being false teachers. And even within the New Testament canon, we know that the oral traditions evolved and was embellished over time. By the end of the first century, for example, they had traditions about the empty tomb and traditions about a literal physical resurrection. And the only way you can get both is if you start with an empty tomb tradition and add the physical resurrection later on as an embellishment. Some folks may wonder why I say that, but just think back to the story of the resurrection of Lazarus. There's a verse in John chapter 12 and verse 10 where it says that the chief priest was going to kill Lazarus after his resurrection on account of so many folks was believing in Jesus because of it. So imagine you's a priest, and you go up to the chief priest and say, "Oh no, we don't gotta kill him. All we gotta do is bribe some guards to say somebody stole his body." Can you imagine the response you'd get? You can't debunk an actual physical resurrection by claiming that the tomb was empty because somebody stole the body. If you've got an actual, literal, physical resurrection, ain't nobody even gonna care about the tomb being empty. The only time the contents of the tomb is going to be interesting enough to become the subject of a tradition is when the empty tomb is all you got. Otherwise, the resurrection is going to hog all the attention and ain't nobody even going to look at the tomb. But on the other hand, if you start with a tradition that only has an empty tomb, and you want a story that's going to validate your belief in a real resurrection, then it makes sense to embellish the original story with details portraying Jesus as actually physically resurrected. So even in the canonical Gospels themselves, we can see Christian tradition growing and being embellished over time, and not all that much time neither. Plus, of course, when we look at the non-canonical Gospels, we see plenty of other examples of the wide range of traditions that was circulating among Christians in the early centuries of the church. Which, of course, is why Dr. Craig don't want believers finding out about them other traditions, and wants them to believe the modern oral tradition about Jews and early Christians memorizing verbatim recitations of a monolithic, unchanging tradition. So what's his next excuse? Quote, number 4, there were significant restraints on the embellishment of traditions about Jesus, such as the presence of eyewitnesses and the apostles' supervision. End quote. And the problem here is that the folks who supposedly going to put restraints on the embellishment is the folks who's most likely to have the strongest motives for adding them. When you believe that Jesus is a divinely appointed Messiah who's going to overthrow the current world order and establish the kingdom of God, and then Jesus ends up dead, that's going to create an overpowering sense of cognitive dissonance. You're going to be desperate for some way to reconcile what you believe about Jesus with what actually happened in the real world. And remember, the historical context here is that believers in first century Palestine thought that God really did reveal himself through dreams and visions, which means that having a dream or a vision counted as pretty much the same thing as being an eyewitness. Now, I ain't saying that folks back then was outright lying, although I can't rule out the possibility that some of them might have stretched the truth more than just a little. But even without deliberate lying, believers is prone to accepting whatever suggestions, interpretations, and spiritual experiences as would validate their beliefs, even today. I once knew a lady who would tell anyone who would listen that she knew God was real because she got cancer, and she prayed for healing, and God miraculously healed her. And I was a believer at the time, and even though I didn't doubt my faith at all, it did still kind of bug me that there weren't no objective, verifiable evidence for God. So I asked her for the details, and she was kind of reluctant to get specific. But I pressed the point, and she finally told me. Turns out her doctor had spotted a small growth on her shoulder that looked like melanoma. So he removed it and sent it off to the lab, and sure enough, it was stage 1 skin cancer. And thing is, that kind of cancer has a 99% cure rate when detected early, which this one was. She could have gone, "Whew, I'm glad we caught that when we did," and then gone on about her life. But she didn't. She got herself all worked up and stressed out because she had skin cancer. And she prayed and went back to the doctor later on, and he checked it out and said, "Yeah, it looks good. We got it all." And that was God working a healing miracle to supernaturally cure her cancer. Now, was she lying? Not really, at least not in her own mind. Her experience, as she understood it, was that God had genuinely intervened supernaturally and saved her from certain death. And that's easy to do if you're motivated to believe in stuff like that, which she was and which the first century believers was too, especially the apostles. Like Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, if in Christ weren't actually raised, then Christians is of all men most to be pitied. And apostles was bearing false witness against God by claiming he raised Jesus when he didn't. That's a pretty powerful motivation to find something to validate what you're preaching. So if you do make mistakes, there's more than likely going to be mistakes that embellish the story and make it more viral. So no, it ain't no restraint on embellishment if the folks doing the restraining has the most to gain by adding them, even unintentionally. And that's especially true when all it takes to be a quote-unquote eyewitness is to have a dream or a vision about Jesus, which, by the way, is exactly the kind of eyewitness that the Apostle Paul claimed to be. And that leaves us with one last excuse that Dr. Craig thinks ought to convince us not to listen to historians and critical scholars. Quote, "Number 5, the gospel writers have a proven track record of historical reliability." End quote. Unfortunately for Dr. Craig, that simply ain't true. We know, for example, that the story of the guards at the tomb was invented because the author of Matthew portrays the priests as trying to debunk the resurrection by saying that disciples stole the body. And you can't debunk an actual physical resurrection accompanied by actual physical eyewitness reports just by thinking up a plausible explanation for the tomb being empty. I mean, think about it. Use one of the priests that condemned Jesus to death for claiming to be the Messiah, and you just found out that he's come back from the dead like Lazarus supposedly did. For all you know, Jesus is in the temple right now preaching and proclaiming the kingdom of God, or maybe even recruiting folks to join his army to overthrow the Romans and or the priesthood that he'd accused of being corrupt. The last thing on your mind is going to be any kind of concern about an empty hole in the ground. You're going to be wondering whether it's even still safe for you to hang around Jerusalem, considering he's come back from the dead and probably ain't going to take too kindly to you having conspired to get him killed. So clearly, the story Matthew tells is a story somebody invented back when all Christians had was a tomb with no body in it, plus widespread reports in Jesus' home country saying that the body had been stolen. And this goes back to what Dr. Craig was saying before about there being constraints on how the story got embellished. Matthew tells us that the local residents was saying that the body was stolen. And instead of this slowing down the gospel, believers just embellished it with this story about the guards. And first century Christians added it to the written gospel because it validated their beliefs. And of course, there's also the problem like what year Jesus was born, whether it was during the reign of Herod or during the governorship of Quirinius, which was several years apart, and the problem of the census making everybody go back to their parents' hometown, which is exactly the way that Romans did not conduct a census, even if one had happened during the reign of Herod, which it didn't. Plus the story of the star guiding the Magi to the exact house where Jesus was, which ain't something that stars actually do. I could go on, but the point is that the Gospels ain't exempt from the need for fact-checking in the particulars. Dr. Craig can tell us that we need to take the Gospel's word for things just because they says so, but historians still need to sift through the reports and separate the fact from the fiction. Yes, there's things in the canonical Gospels that does fact-check as true, just like some things in the non-canonical Gospels is also true. But the thing is, you can't legitimately reason from the fact that some things is true to the conclusion that therefore everything else must be true too. Each claim has to stand or fall on its own merits. And yet, here's Dr. Craig trying to convince us that it's somehow unfair to hold the canonical documents up to the same standards as any other historical documents, even though he started out by saying that we should. It's just a confused mess, and that might be intentional so as we just give up and quit trying to figure it all out. But that ain't what you and me is here for, so we're going to go on ahead and think about it and hold the canonical documents to the same standards as the non-canonical ones. And if they can't pass the test, that ain't our fault. We ain't assuming that they has to be false. We's just saying, well, let's look and see whether they's true or not. That's how the historical method works, and that's the best way to find out the truth. And I'm sure there's more that could be said, but that's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, Dr. Craig is going to go back and zoom in on arguments number 1 and number 5 and try and make his case sound stronger. And that's going to give us an opportunity to zero in on some important weaknesses in the arguments he's been trying to make. So it should be fun. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.